Barry Butters does. Remo Williams, The Adventure Begins. So there are two main reasons why I wanted to talk about this film. First of all, I reckon it's a very underrated movie, but it's also got an interesting connection to James Bond. It was directed by the brilliant Guy Hamilton, who was the bloke who directed Goldfinger. And like James Bond, Remo Williams was based on a successful novel series. On top of that, there's also another connection to Bond, because the screenwriter for this film is Christopher Wood, and he wrote the screenplay for two James Bond films, The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker. After the success of the James Bond franchise, I'd say it was pretty inevitable that writers and studios would be interested in creating an American version of James Bond. So long before Jason Bourne, there was Remo Williams. But whereas Jason Bourne was incredibly successful and established a franchise of its own, Remo Williams, well, how should I put this?
It was one of those things where the film just didn't reach its potential.
I was disappointed that the film did not do better, for my own selfish reasons, and also because I was very fond of the producers, very fond of Joel Grey and Fred Ward. I was hoping this would have been a franchise.
I think that Orion had a lot of hopes on this because the Destroyer series, which I had never even heard of when I got hired, but it turned out this was a big deal all over the world. So I think Orion saw it as a huge franchise. And in fact, even in their hiring of Guy Hamilton, who had, of course, done a lot of the Bond films and was a real seasoned pro, to say the least at that point, they really hoped for a lot out of the film. Unfortunately, the film didn't do all that well.
The subtitle of this film, The Adventure Begins, actually makes me a little sad.
Remo Williams, The Adventure Begins.
Because it signals such a strong expectation that they were planning to make more of these films. But the problem was, not enough people went to see it. So why were the filmmakers so confident that this film would have a lot of sequels? Well, on paper it had a lot of elements that would have made this film seem like a surefire hit. Like I already said, you got an esteemed director with Guy Hamilton, but it also had a likeable star with a good track record. And on top of that, it was also based on a successful and well-loved novel series. It also had plenty of action. You've also got a respectable supporting cast of actors. But the thing is, none of this seemed to help, because the film didn't do too well. Maybe it all had something to do with the fact that it just had a terrible poster, which looked like it had been drawn by a moderately talented 12-year-old. Yeah, it looks pretty bad from a distance, but when you take a closer look, it looks even worse. But I think the film's lack of success had something to do with the fact of when it was released. Because it came out slap bang in the middle of the 1980s action explosion. So whereas Rambo 2 earned $300 million at the box office in the same year of 1985, Remo Williams only made $14 million. So this was a huge flop that guaranteed there wouldn't be any sequels. But in my opinion, I think this all comes down to mismarketing, because it's not anything like films like Commando or Rambo 2. Whereas those films were definitely meant for adults, Remo Williams is more of a family movie. After all, it's filled with lots of jokes that everyone can understand.
Do you know why Americans call it fast food? Because it feeds them on the way to the grave. As I feared, you have no sense of humor.
It hasn't got any sex in it.
Hi.
Hi.
And the violence is very mild. Or maybe everyone else is right and I'm just wrong. Nah, that can't be right. This film also uses the very familiar idea of the wise Asian master training a naive Westerner. Some people might say this was an Hollywood trope. The Karate Kid is probably the most famous example of this, with Daniel LaRusso and Mr. Miyagi.
Show me wax on, wax off. Catch! 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 Catch!
But this idea also resurfaces again in films like The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise and Kill Bill with Uma Thurman. And I think there's a pretty strong case for saying that it's also in Star Wars, although in a disguised form.
You must unlearn what you have learned.
All right, I'll give it a try.
No, try not. Do or do not. There is no try.
But this film does contain something that might be a problem now that wasn't so much of a problem back in 1985. Because it also does something very unfashionable in having a white man playing an Asian character.
They had interviewed and perhaps even videotaped several Korean actors, but they felt that Joel had a particular quality that they wanted. He was a dancer, he was light on his feet, obviously, could move very well, and that was part of their vision. Chun's ability to move, and almost you have the feeling that when he's walking, he's never touching the ground.
And nowadays there's a sort of general prohibition about crossing racial lines in this way. Although no one seemed to care very much about Tropic Thunder.
God damn it! We lost! We fucking super lost, man! Tell them, McCluskey. Tell them what time it is.
I don't believe you people.
Huh? What do you mean, you people?
What do you mean, you people?
Huh?
I had the part, but I wasn't going to do it unless I could, as an actor, believe it myself, and that I was certain that it wouldn't insult the Asian community.
You did not ask to be white, so perhaps that is not your fault.
The other fun aspect of this film is that it takes an average Joe and turns him into a superhero. Well, almost a superhero. He goes from being a lazy slob to a martial arts badass. But let's stop beating around the bush and get into the nitty gritty. So the film starts with a shot of the Hudson River and the New York skyline, and there's a sound of a basketball game on a car radio. After this shot pans across, we get an interior shot of a police car and Fred Ward as a New York cop. He's on a stakeout and he's eating a bunch of junk food. So in a matter of seconds, the film very skillfully sets up the character. There's also a nice little detail like the cup holder, which further establishes the character of a New York cop who is a sort of ordinary working man. He likes sports and enjoys fast food. He's a relatable ordinary bloke. So right away we know we're in the territory of a blue-collar hero. He's a bit like Bruce Willis in the Die Hard franchise. And very early on in the film he gets into a fight, and this establishes that he's a sort of brawler. He's tough but unskilled. He gets the better of 3 opponents, but it's a very scrappy fight. But then after this fight, he's shoved into a river by an anonymous black guy in a trench coat. We then immediately cut to his funeral, and we find out that his name was Sam Makin. The same bloke who we saw push him in the river also hovers at a distance at the funeral. So the film starts with a mystery that draws you in. Who is this man, and why is he attending a funeral of a New York cop that he just killed? But then in the next scene, it's revealed that the New York cop wasn't actually killed. Up until this point, the film has been quite serious, but around the 10-minute mark we get the first joke.
That's not me. What the hell have you done to me?
We did some work on you. Just your face.
So this is the first indication that the film is going to have a more light-hearted tone. And this is then maintained over the rest of the film. There's also immediately another funny joke, because Remo Williams gets his name from a logo on a hospital bedpan.
You got a new face, new fingerprints, even a new name. Williams. Remo Williams. A lot of thought went into it.
We find out that this bloke is called McCleary, and he's part of a secret government agency. Soon after these events at the hospital, the film establishes the larger theme of political corruption. So basically these blokes are from Cure, which is a secret organisation that's acting under orders from the president. And the objective of this secret organisation is to hold people accountable for their crimes when the ordinary processes have failed. Then after his initial debriefing, Remo is introduced to his new mentor, and he's a martial arts expert called Chun.
Hold it! I don't want to kill you, but I will if I have to.
Even the way the editing works in this film is funny. I'm thinking particularly of this bullet dodge that slows down and then Remo squints and waits to see if it lands. I don't know why exactly, but this never fails to make me laugh out loud. After introducing the character of Chun, the film then establishes that this bloke called George Grove is Remo's target. Now he's a weapons dealer who's engaged in bribery and tax evasion. The middle section of the film is then taken up with Remo's training. But I think the way they do this is very effective, because after you're about 35 minutes in, you get a slight indication that it's starting to work. The transformation is underway. But after initially disliking him, Remo starts to look up to Chun, and then he even starts looking for his approval. And then he's disappointed when he doesn't get it. So the whole thing has a sort of father-son dynamic, or master and pupil.
Ta-da!
The film also deepens the conspiracy at this point, because the arms manufacturer is shown to be developing faulty equipment, which then results in a serious accident. So the corruption deepens at this point. And the film also shows Grove in conversation with an army official, and he tells him to suppress the report about the faulty weapons. The action set piece that takes place around the Statue of Liberty is also really great. It's about midway through Remo's training, so it shows that he's come a long way, but that he's also not quite ready. So it works very well in terms of pacing and the general arc of the story. Around the 1 hour and 15 minute mark, the film also takes a slightly darker turn, because the head of Cure reveals that all 3 agents will kill themselves in the event of being identified, in order to protect the organisation. And in these circumstances, Chun would be charged with killing Remo. Chun then also reveals in person to Remo that this is part of his contract.
There is something you wish to ask? The answer is yes. If the Emperor Smith so ordered it, I would have to kill you. It is in the contract.
And this results in a temporary rift between the 2 male leads, and it sort of interrupts their burgeoning father-son relationship. But there is a sort of look of wavering uncertainty and mixed feelings on Chun's face, which shows that he's sort of in conflict, and it also makes their relationship more interesting. At this point in the story, Remo investigates Grove Aerospace, and he breaks into this warehouse to have a look at this weapon called ARP, which is an advanced weapon being developed by Grove with government funding. Unfortunately, at this point, McCleary dies, but he was able to steal some computer files, and he gives these to Remo before he dies. And after this, they get proof that the advanced weapon is actually a fake, and Grove is lying to the government and getting away with it. And this takes us into the final act of the movie, where Remo assassinates Grove. One slightly surprising thing about Remo Williams is that there's a suddenly surprising spike in the level of violence towards the end. This happens when Remo is captured by Grove's henchmen, and like James Bond, he has to make a daring escape. I think this single scene is the reason why this film probably got a PG-13 certificate in the US and a 15 certificate in the UK. The thing is, it's so great that it would have been a shame to cut it out, but maybe they could have toned it down a bit. But at this point the clock is really ticking, and Remo realises he hasn't got much time left before he has to kill Grove, because he's under orders to make it look like an accident. But then it also comes across as a bit of an accident about how he manages to do it, because the thing is, he's running through the woods during an artillery bombardment, so he has to dodge all these bombs. And then he jumps off this rock face and he lands on a tree. But then this tree is transported into the air. And Remo has to hang on for dear life. But then very luckily he's able to drop the log on these other logs. And then that causes a type of log avalanche. And it knocks Grove off his jeep. So the thing is, the log idea is it's a bit crap, to be honest. But the thing is, the film does manage to redeem itself after this point, because it's got an ending that completes Remo Williams' character arc. Because by the end, Remo has developed the same skills that Chun revealed at the start of the film. And he also comes to accept his new identity as Remo Williams. So it's a perfect ending. So why do I like this film so much? Well, I think the substance of the film is what makes it so enjoyable. And that's the relationship between the two male leads. So it's basically a buddy movie. But if the relationship doesn't seem charming or delightful to you, then the whole film isn't going to work. Now, although I like this film a lot, and think it's also quite underrated, I also don't think it's perfect. And one issue I have is with Kate Mulgrew. Now, I do like her and I think she's a good actress, but I think she's slightly miscast in this film, because she's a very specific type. She's a sort of tough authority figure, which is one of the reasons why she works so well as Janeway in Star Trek. And I can kind of see why she was cast in this role, because she makes quite a believable soldier. But as a love interest for Remo, she doesn't quite work, and there's zero chemistry between them. But I should point out that it never goes beyond a mild flirtation in the film.
I remember passing out in the...
I think we better keep moving.
But then I also think that they were probably going to develop this relationship in the subsequent films that they thought they were going to make. But on balance, I can't help thinking that it might have worked better with a softer female actress. I'm thinking of someone like Goldie Hawn, who played a soldier in Private Benjamin, because you need a girl who can be funny and charming.
Hey, Judy. What time is it? I just took your picture, Mama.
But thanks anyway.
Come on, move it, Benjamin. I don't want to see you stop running unless you collapse, faint, or puke.
After the box office failure of this film, the screenwriter Christopher Wood questioned the wisdom of casting Fred Ward as the leading man. So let's talk about Fred Ward in a bit more detail. I'd say he's a very likeable and charming presence in any film he tends to appear in. He's a very relatable blue-collar hero. And I think he's very well cast in this role too. He also handles the character arc of the film very well, because he starts out as a complete slob. And over the course of the film he becomes a martial arts master. Maybe it's just because audiences weren't used to seeing Fred Ward as a leading man, but more as a character actor or a sidekick. And then when he finally did get his chance to shine in 1985, he was a little too old. But in general I don't really agree with this criticism, and I find the audience's lack of enthusiasm a bit hard to understand. And although he don't have much chemistry with Kate Mulgrew,
Hi.
he has a lot of chemistry with Joel Grey.
You know, Chun, there are times when I really like you.
Of course. I am Chun.
And there are times when I can really kill you.
Good. We will practice that after dinner.
Another problem with this film and this is actually a more serious problem, concerns an element of the plot. And this is what film critics call the antagonist. So in the film, this is George Grove. So what are George Grove's crimes exactly? Well, he's a weapons contractor who's paid by the American government. But then he cuts corners by first of all developing weapons that are faulty, and then he's being paid for developing a super weapon that don't actually exist. But this is all a little strange and confusing, because it don't really fit the type of film that Remo Williams is. The idea of a corrupt arms manufacturer seems more suited to a political thriller and a more serious tone. I'm thinking of films like The Manchurian Candidate. I think you can go with a more complicated plot with that sort of movie, but Remo Williams is a fun and light-hearted adventure, so it shouldn't really be a film where you have to think so hard. Another problem with the story concerns something I've already mentioned, but I'll repeat it again here more briefly, and that's all the problems with the third act of the movie. So as I was saying earlier on in the review, Remo Williams' assassination of Grove actually comes across as more of an accident or a stroke of luck, which is a bit of a misstep in the final act of the story. But then, as I also said earlier, I do think they managed to redeem this problem by having a very exciting finale, where Remo dodges the bullets from Grove's gun and then disarms him and kills him, which completes his character arc from lazy slob to martial arts master. There's also another issue about this film that might have been a problem for audiences, but isn't actually a problem for me. And this concerns the fantasy elements of the film, because Chun is an expert in the fictional martial art of Sananju. So this ain't a real martial art, but just something that they use in the fictional universe of Remo Williams. And I think this also explains why they went for a light-hearted tone, because it means you won't take things too serious when they introduce elements in the story that aren't exactly realistic. So we already talked about the bullet dodge, which is obviously something you couldn't really do in real life. But there's also this thing that Chun does, which is like a magical punch. So have a look at this.
You always talk like a Chinese fortune cookie.
Now this is obviously not realistic, but it works very well within the confines of the story, and it gels perfectly well with the tone of the movie. And then the other thing in the film that ain't realistic is the way that Remo Williams is able to float above the ground. Yeah, so have a look at this.
Look.
Now this is all going to come across as very silly if you see Remo Williams in the context of 1980s action movies. But as I've said before, I don't think Remo Williams is this kind of film. It's an action-adventure movie intended for the family that has lots of light-hearted fantasy elements. Yeah, so I can kind of understand why this might have been confusing or off-putting for some members of the audience. But I think if you understand the tone of the film, this ain't really a problem at all. Now before we wrap things up, I think it's worthwhile having a look at some contemporary reviews. This review from Variety is a good example of how most people saw the film at the time. Yeah, so it goes, Remo Williams is a poor man's James Bond, with a dash of 2 or 3 other popular genres thrown in for good measure. The film never seems to know where it's going. But the Los Angeles Times gave the film a good review, so I'm not completely alone after all. So this is what they said. Remo Williams is a slam-bang action adventure loaded with surprises. Just when you think it's gonna be just another bone cruncher steeped in patriotic paranoia, it sends itself up hilariously. Remo Williams has some of the funniest, brightest dialogue heard on screen all year. But then in closing they made this comment that hasn't aged very well. Doubtless we're going to see more of Remo and Chun. It's not for nothing that Remo Williams is subtitled The Adventure Begins. So in closing, why do I think this film didn't really take off? I think it had to do with a combination of factors. First of all, I think the film was marketed wrong. It should have been sold as a family movie. And I think they should have been willing to make changes to the film in order to get a lower certificate. The film also came out during the 1980s action boom, but it doesn't quite fit in with that mode of filmmaking, because it's not anywhere near violent enough. But if you ever find yourself in a light-hearted mood, and sort of wanting to watch a film that doesn't take itself too seriously, then I think you can't really go too far wrong with Remo Williams. But if you decided it weren't very good, then I'm sorry.